is one of our clergy leaders here at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. He is also serving as part-time leader for the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island. Richard studied at the Humanist Institute and holds a Doctor of Ministry in Interfaith Pastoral Counseling from the Hebrew Union College. He also holds degrees from New York University and the New York Law School. Richard is a longtime member of the ethical culture community, having been a member of the Society in White Plains for many years. He served as the president in the late 90s and early 2000s. He was also active with the American Ethical Union, our national federation, serving on its board, and he was its president from 2012 to 2015. Richard lives in northern Westchester, and every August he is usually generous with the tomatoes that he grows in his garden. Welcome, Richard Koral.
It's always a question what you're going to be remembered for most, right? Well, tomatoes is not so terrible. I can go with the tomatoes. Well, I really want to recognize and thank Bonita and David for their music this morning, and for the wonderful statement by Barbara about today's concerns. So, and it's a little bit late, I'm going to launch right into what I wanted to speak to you about, which is what is ethical culture's sense of spirituality? I have an old friend who moved to the States from India some 30 years ago, and I've known him for about 25 of those years. So one thing he explained to me about a Hindu worldview is the notion that one can trace 4 stages in a person's life. There's a stage of childhood during which one is simply living under the care of one's parents and under the structure provided by one's teachers. Then, when one is a young adult and starting a family of one's own, there is the time of the generative years, providing for others, building a stable home and maybe a business. The third stage, one is more mature and established and is in a position to guide those coming up after you. Others rely on you now as you assure their security and their benefit. But after that job is done, after the children are grown, after the responsibilities to others are largely fulfilled, you then have the time and the freedom to sit back and devote yourself to the consideration of the larger questions. So it's at this stage of life in the Hindu tradition that a man, and usually it was a man, but not always, would renounce his connections to society, don the simple garb, a dhoti, and go off to live a life of simplicity, contemplation, wandering. This stage, referred to as sannyasa, it's the time for someone to bring his attention away from the material concerns that engaged him all his life and to devote himself instead to the spiritual. Well, what is this person looking for, actually? We assume that he's experienced enough of life to understand how the world is organized because he may have largely succeeded in navigating it. We assume that he's looking for the answers to the big questions, those generally described as the spiritual concerns. What is the meaning of life? Why are we here? Where are we going? Is there significance to all this sturm and drama? And he is to devote the rest of his life to this project. While not too many of us really are ready to take up the begging bowl, or dress in a simple dhoti, wander as a hobo in search of wisdom, there is, though, here too a tradition of hitting the open road, right? Say on a motorcycle or an RV, to seek inspiration in the national parks, or to devote oneself to volunteer service in search of a connection and of insight. Spiritual connections and a spiritual insight. In every culture, People everywhere seek answers to the big questions. There have been many different ideas about what is spiritual and what is truth. Sages and charlatans alike have offered all sorts of revelations and insights to respond to the questions posed by people yearning to understand the meaning of existence and our place in the universe. In the millennia before the scientific age, there was little knowledge about how the world actually worked, but there was a great deal of imagination devoted to filling in the blanks. So with ideas born of magic and the supernatural, what emerged in virtually every human community around the world was some kind of theology created to satisfy people's search for meaning. We today who live in the age of science have a great advantage over those people of earlier times. So many of the mysteries have been cracked. We know what causes infections, or at least only for the last 170 years have we known. We know now that they're not brought by dark angels with reapers, and we now know how infections can be combated, for example. We know what causes earthquakes. It's not the anger of the gods. Well, we've only known for about the last 30 years, actually, what causes earthquakes. And the notion of us all riding on the back of a turtle is only partially useful as a metaphor. We know that our entire world, the place where all the giants battled and all the gods made miracles, is but one speck in a galaxy that itself is just one galaxy among hundreds of billions of galaxies. Well, we knew that only for the last 90 years or so. We now know that the emergence of life and the many creatures on this planet, including ourselves, is the product of undirected evolution over billions of years and not some sudden willful act of creation by a fickle God. Or at least many of us have acknowledged this during merely the last 160 years or so. This grasp on reality is so recent, so new in our history. Well, does this now answer all of our questions and exempt us from the need to find spiritual meaning in the larger scheme of things? Assuming there is a scheme of things. We also seek answers to the big questions, even those of us who do not see a plan behind the creation of the universe. But where is this spiritual sensibility among those in ethical culture? Ed Erickson, a much beloved ethical culture leader of the late 20th century, said this about it: "The spiritual life is simply human life in its more dazzling moments of self-realization. The spiritual experiences are the life experiences at their fullest, those peaks of insight by which we see our lives made whole and transformed." That's something that can be achieved by all of us, but how do you seek it? Is it something that happens to you? Well, I recently stumbled on a platform address given by Felix Adler, the founder of ethical culture, dating from 1904, in which he explains his view on spirituality from an ethical culture perspective. In founding ethical culture, Adler sought to create a community in which people would seek the higher life without recourse to magic and speculations about things supernatural. So what is Adler's higher life, and where would it take us? Is there a spiritual essence, and if so, what is it? As we all know, his answer was primarily ethics. That is to say, it is in the relations between people and among people, the relations between people and nature. And it's there that we're to find the higher values and the higher goals. In these arenas, we have the power to make our relations and build our communities in our own images, and therefore we are to make meaning more than we might find meaning. In other words, rather than look for meaning in life, We can instill meaning into the lives that we have by infusing our lives with value, purpose, and mindfulness. So Adler found spiritual fulfillment in this world while not seeking satisfaction or meaning in something like the beyond. So today it's our job to always ask the question, is that enough? Is that enough to serve us in today's world? Now, Adler always explained that he was not an atheist, but rather he had a deep spiritual sensibility. However, it was not to be found in any kind of a Godhead. Instead, he found an exalted reality in the very fact that there is an infinite interconnectedness in all things in the universe and in all life. He was a lover of nature. He had a retreat up in the Adirondack Mountains where he repaired to every summer with his family. He occasionally described a visualization that he had that epitomized this sense of interconnectedness. It was something he dubbed, and some of you may recognize the expression, the ethical manifold. Now, this ethical manifold is explained as the dynamic by which spirit or energy flows from one person to another and throughout the entire fabric of a community. This is the way we nurture each other and we thrive through what we share. In his book, An Ethical Philosophy of Life, he said, and bear with me with some of the archaic language for a moment, we may use the term spiritual to designate that infinite system of interdependence in which people as ethical entities have their place. Only as a member of the infinite spiritual universe does one possess the twofold attributes implied in worth: inviolability with respect to others and indefeasible intrinsic preciousness. So he said then that we have replaced the notion of God as a source of spirituality with a universe of spiritual beings interacting in infinite harmony. So this is the closest that he came to some kind of an iconic imagery that you could call a little out of this world. He described the image like a vision in the following way. Each ethical entity, that is to say, each person, each member of the infinite universe, could be regarded as the center from which a ray of light emanates, touching other centers or persons, and awakening there the light intrinsic in the other person. Each one's life is enmeshed in interconnecting light and universal life without the loss of one's own distinctness. The everlasting selfhood to be achieved by means of the cross relation. So we spark the light in others. Light comes from ourselves, hits someone else, and sparks light in them, which is returned or passed on. Well, I once discovered that this imagery of his may really have been drawn from an ancient Vedic myth from India. He did study Eastern religions, and this is the legend of Indra's net. And the story, it's a fable. It goes like this. Far away in the heavenly abode of the great god Indra, there is a wonderful net which has been hung by some cunning builder in such a manner that it stretches out infinitely in all directions. In accordance with the extravagant taste of the deities, the builder has hung a single glittering jewel in each eye of the net. That is, say, those cross lines of the net. And since the net itself is infinite in dimension, the jewels are infinite in number. There hang the jewels glittering like stars of the first magnitude, a wonderful sight to behold. If we arbitrarily select one of these jewels for inspection and look at it closely, we will discover that in its polished surface there are reflected all the other jewels in the net, infinite in number. Not only that, but each of the jewels reflected in this one jewel is also reflecting all the other jewels, so that there is an infinite reflecting process occurring. So I saw a depiction of this, a drawing, and I'm going to show it to you. And there are two pictures. One is a natural version of it, and they go back and forth, so I don't know which one's going to show it's not. Oh, no, that's not it. Yes, no, that's not it. Oh, there we go. So that's the thing, and this is a natural version of it. The glittering jewels of a spider's web. So this is it extending over the whole palace of Indra. I'm going to turn the lights on if I can see that. Great, thank you. So Indra's net serves as a metaphor for a universe of infinite interconnectedness, or as it was later reinterpreted in Buddhist philosophy, it illustrates the concept of interpenetration, or as they sometimes say, dependent origination. So there's a great commonality. To my understanding, Adler didn't go further to consider magical kind of things that might have flowed from this notion, like a universal consciousness, some may go to, or universal souls, but he saw interconnectedness itself as something fundamental to our nature or our very composition, and nature to be the universal medium. But as individuals, we remain each unique and bearing individual worth. So, if to Felix Adler, spirituality means interconnectedness and interdependence, what would be a spiritual practice? How does one live? How does one comport oneself to cultivate the higher life, a spiritual connectedness? How does one achieve that mindfulness that opens the door to this higher life? So that's what the 1904 platform addresses. Adler acknowledges that not all of us can expect to achieve sainthood. It would not be reasonable plan to tell someone that they should emulate a Mother Teresa or a Nelson Mandela. Few of us have the fortitude to sacrifice ourselves in the service of such noble causes, and few of us are given the opportunity to move the levers of society to effect great changes. But as real people, we can still live our lives so as to make real the values that we subscribe to and to achieve a wholeness in our own beings. So you'll see that he does not seek otherworldliness as a kind of ideal. Adler is very much in this space. So he highlights three elements of this practice which can guide us in our daily lives and to strive towards the higher, more ethical life. The first element sounds like a prescription to meditate, but it differs in an important way. He suggests setting time aside each day for quiet reflection. So he said, I'm going to quote, "Acquire the habit of ever and anon," I love that, don't you love that old language? "Acquire the habit of ever and anon detaching oneself and one's doings, escaping from the sweeping current and standing on the shore. For this purpose, it is advisable to consecrate certain times, preferably a certain time each day, to self-recollection, to dedicate an hour or a half hour to seeing one's life in all its relations. That is, as the poet has put it, to seeing life steadily and seeing it whole." So to pause for this meditative practice will help a person maintain, he says, a certain mental poise. A salient characteristic of spirituality, he says, is calmness, and without a period of detachment, you cannot achieve calmness. And he writes, even if you spend all your time pursuing wonderful projects and philanthropic goals, you'll still drive yourself into a frazzle unless you take a healthful pause for reflection. He seems to define mindfulness somewhat differently than we are accustomed to today, though. One is to use the time to appreciate the connectedness in one's life, to appreciate the mundane and small, and their links with the precious and the noble. To reflect, say, on the family meal as it joins the generations. To reflect on the relation between one's own work and the workings of all society. To reflect on the part one's good efforts play in the establishing the value of goodness itself. We can mentally detach ourselves from the details and, standing aloof as an impartial spectator, consider the direction that our lives and actions are taking us. To my mind, this contrasts with the Zen practice of detachment in meditative practice, the letting go, the releasing of attachments. Ethical culture in Adler's vision is to embrace the attachments. A second element of the spiritual life would be to live as if this were your last hour. So Adler notes that everyone avoids the thought of death, or at most someone will morbidly imagine how this mortal coil will soon pass, how all the people we see will soon be dust, and the troubles and anxieties we now endure will soon become irrelevant. But Adler poses a different possibility. He suggests that if a person were to recognize his or her immediate mortality, everything frivolous, vain, every cheap pleasure, gambling, cruelty, trickery in business, social snobbishness, will all be suddenly seen as trite and foolish, a distraction from the things that are enduring, important, and valuable. So this awareness of mortality will serve to clarify the mind and enable us to sift out the true values from the false, the things that are worthwhile from the things that are shallow and not worthwhile. The attitude of living as if this is your last hour is not to rob you of the healthy relish of life, but rather to enhance the relish for real living, the kind of living that's devoted to things that are truly worthwhile. And the third element of the spiritual life, he explains, is the most important. He wrote, "Learn to look upon any pains and injuries which you may have to endure as you would upon the same pains and injuries endured by someone else. If you're sick and suffering, remember what you would say to someone else who is sick and suffering. Remember how you would remind them that they are not the first or the only one that has been in similar circumstances. How you would expect out of that person fortitude in bearing the pain as an evidence of human dignity. So exhort yourself in the same way, expect the same fortitude of yourself. If anyone did you wrong, remember what you would have advised someone else if it happened to them. The judgment that you pass on others, pass on yourself. And the fact that you are able to do so, that you have the power to rise above your subjective self and take the universal point of view with respect to yourself, will give you a powerful sense of enfranchisement, of poise, and spiritual dignity. At the same time, look upon others as being, from the moral point of view, just as important as you are. Indeed, realize that every human being is but another self, a part of the same spiritual being that is in you, a complement to yourself, a part of your essential being. Realize that the unity that subsists between you and your fellow men and women, and then your life will be spiritual indeed. Now, that's a powerful call for walking the walk of equality. And it's a powerful call to the imagination to realize and to internalize the implication of this sense of the unity of spirit of all humanity as a collective force. Do we believe it? If we do, then we must strive to make equality with others our self-definition, and empathy for the struggles of others our reality. We must enable ourselves to be with them and experience their pain. So Adler's vision of spirituality has little to do with withdrawal from the world. There are no monks in his movement. He didn't value retreating into any abstract speculations about eternity. He found the real world to be his medium and his universe. It was very much in this world that he found inspiration for spiritual fulfillment, and his practices reflect that. His spiritual pilgrim going off on sannyasa would not be seeking a silent retreat in a monastery. He or she would be looking to organize against fossil fuels, organizing for bail reform, or finding ways to feed the hungry. Is this a possible model for today? Well, I think it's clear that empathy and equity and a relinquishment of the greed that has marked our species for such a long part of our history would help prepare us for our lives in the real future that is dawning upon us. We are entering an era unlike any other experienced by our species. It will be a world of overcrowding, artificial environment, of great wealth and great poverty. It will call for a new person, a person with kind of insight that has not been known in times past. I think Adler's vision has more relevance to us now than ever before. His definition of spirituality that may help people survive in a crowded world that we are entering. It can ennoble those with the skills and the fortitude to thrive in a hyper-connected society in which empathy is the language of exchange and mutual support the currency of survival. So Adler was not stuck in the 19th century. He was clearly ahead of his time. Thanks so much.